When this woman starts raising a tiny owl, her dog becomes a sort of protector for the little bird. The two creatures rarely interact by themselves. But one day, she steps away for a few minutes, and when she comes back, she finds her giant shepherd doing something that makes her cry. As she frantically looked around the shed for the tiny owl in her care, Sandra tried not to make any sudden movement or loud noise. She knew that her dog was somewhere around there, and didn't want to frighten him into doing something horrible. Billy was a sweet dog, but he knew he wasn't supposed to play with the owl, and she feared that he might react unpredictably if he mistook her worry for anger. As she shuffled around the shed, she wondered how she could have been so stupid as to leave such a big dog all alone in a small cramped room with a tiny fragile owl. She had been rescuing wild animals for years after all, and she knew better than to expose them to dangers and risks. Sandra Brandt, a wildlife and nature photographer from Germany, had always had a deep love for animals. She had a particular passion for rescuing birds and currently looked after many different types of hawks and owls. Her latest rescue had really tugged on her heartstrings, though. A family of owls ready to welcome some little owlets. The owls had been nesting on Sandra's property for some time. She didn't just rescue animals. She also provided safe spaces for wild creatures when they needed to rest, and the owls were currently occupying a nest in one of the sheds Sandra had built as a shelter. She would regularly check on the owls and was excited to see 7 eggs in the nest. She was already thinking about the photo opportunities she would have when the eggs started to hatch. She always made sure to have her camera with her whenever she went to the shed and patiently waited for the owlets to come out of their shell, literally. One morning, Sandra's wish came true when 6 of the eggs began to hatch. Sure that the 7th egg would soon follow, Sandra kept a watch over the nest all day. 6 little owlets now occupied the nest and kept their parents busy. But the 7th egg remained without any cracks in it, and the family seemed to forget that there was still an owlet left to hatch. Sandra grew increasingly concerned. The next day, Sandra awoke early, hoping that the 7th egg had hatched overnight, but her heart sank when she entered the shed and saw the egg still in the nest. It was still perfectly smooth, with no cracks in sight. Sandra resigned herself to the fact that the 7th owlet probably wouldn't hatch. As sad as that was, it was just the way life went sometimes. Since owls are wild animals, Sandra tried not to intervene too much. Also, seeing as there was nothing wrong with the rest of the owls, she had no choice but to accept that the 7th owlet probably hadn't survived. Another day passed and Sandra went to check on the owls once more. But this time there was seemingly some good news. The 7th egg now had cracks in it, and she could see it was moving. The little owlet inside was alive and trying to free itself from the shell. Sandra set herself up in the shed ready to witness the 7th owlet hatching. But hours passed and the tiny bird still hadn't emerged. Movement from the shell had slowed down, and it was clear that the little bird was becoming exhausted. Sandra struggled with not being able to help out. The little owlet had been so close to hatching, but now it looked like it wouldn't make it. Sandra knew that if she reached into the nest to help, there was a chance that the adult owls would abandon all the babies. But she couldn't risk it, because they weren't old enough to look after themselves. As night fell, the 7th owlet seemed to find some extra strength all of a sudden, and its little head broke through the shell. Sandra let out a small cry of joy. But the little owlet's struggles weren't over yet. The young owl, whom Sandra immediately named Napoleon, Poldy for short, was much smaller than his siblings as he'd hatched 2 days after them. The other 6 owlets had formed a bond as they'd all hatched within hours of each other, but none of them seemed interested in Poldy. However, she knew that without their warmth, care, and camaraderie, he wouldn't survive. The little owlet had come so far that Sandra knew she couldn't just sit back and leave the defenseless bird on his own. When it became clear that the rest of the owls wouldn't take care of Poldy, she finally stepped in. Poldy was placed in his own nest where Tanya could feed him and monitor his health. He needed lots of hand feeding and grooming, and she made sure to provide both of them. But it looked like even her best efforts would prove futile. Poldy didn't seem likely to catch up on his siblings' growth, and his parents weren't worried about the outlet that had been taken from the nest. The poor little thing was all alone in the world now. All alone, except for her. Sandra decided to place a quick call to a wildlife veterinarian she'd grown close to since she'd started rescuing animals, and explained what was going on with the tiny owl. The vet asked her for a few pictures to understand how small of a bird they were talking about, and was surprised to see that Poldy was truly minuscule for an owl. He would never live freely as he was too small to survive in the wild, and since he was being reared by a human instead of his parents, he would never have the natural instincts of his siblings. But at least he was safe, and that's all that mattered to Sandra. The vet suggested she put his food in different places to build some curiosity in him, and to encourage him to fly by moving his nest a little higher up. Sandra took his advice to heart and did her best to take care of the little owl. She would visit Poldy at regular intervals throughout the day, and her Belgian Shepherd Billy was always by her side. Billy was another one of Sandra's rescues. She'd always felt a special connection to dogs. She dreamed of the day when she'd have a dog of her own. Billy had been her loyal companion for a few years now. He'd spend days out in the woods with Sandra as she took photos of the animals and the landscape. When she made her rounds, checking on all her rescue animals, Billy was always by her side. But life with him hadn't always been this relaxed. Billy had overcome some tough moments to become the loyal companion he now was, and it was Sandra's love and support that had transformed his life. The giant dog came from a long line of police dogs, and from the moment he was born, it seemed as though his future was already laid out for him. But when Billy was just a puppy, it became clear that he wouldn't become a police dog. When he was still small, Sandra adopted him and set to work training the nervous little dog. Years of hard work had gone into Billy, and now he was a gentle giant who took his role as her companion very seriously. The dog often enjoyed visiting the other animals Sandra looked after, and once he got to know them, he would become brave and often wander over to them for a quick check and a sniff. Things with Poldy were very different, though. Whenever Sandra entered the shed where Poldy was, Billy would hang back at the entrance as if he were aware of how delicate the little owl was. Things stayed like this for a few weeks. Sandra would walk to the shed and Billy would follow her as usual, but as soon as they got to the door, the dog would remain outside. It looked like the two creatures weren't destined to become friends, but Poldy was growing more confident with each day that passed, and soon, curiosity got the better of him. The day started like any other. Tanya awoke early, ready to do her morning checks on the rescue animals. She'd recently taken in some more birds, and also had a fox in her care that had been injured in a trap. As she looked out of the window, a plan for the rest of the day formulated in her head. Sandra knew that it was the perfect day to head out into the woods at the back of her home to capture some beautiful winter photos. So she started thinking of all the locations where she could capture some pics to share on her website. Knowing that they were heading out on their morning rounds, Billy patiently waited at the door. This morning, Sandra decided to visit Poldy first. Although she was confident that Poldy's nest was warm, temperatures had dropped overnight, and she just wanted to be sure that the little owlet was okay. As soon as she entered the shed, Poldy popped his head up over the side of the nest to greet her. As usual, Billy hung back, but Poldy did something he'd never done before. The little owlet flew down from his nest and landed right in front of Billy, as if to introduce himself. Sandra was certain that the dog would be gentle, but she still kept a close eye on the interaction. The giant shepherd bent down and gave Poldy a little sniff, then sat down in front of the owlet as if he approved of the greeting. Sandra's face broke out into a smile. Her two favorite animals had finally interacted with each other. That moment forever changed the way Billy behaved towards Poldy. Each morning when Sandra came downstairs, the shepherd would already be waiting by the front door. As soon as she went outside, Billy would head in the direction of Poldy's shed, whether Sandra had intended to go there first or not. The thought had crossed her mind that Billy had been able to sense how fragile Poldy was and had been waiting for the little bird to interact on his terms. But now, he was keen to see his new friend. He still exercised some caution, though, and would always hang back and wait for Poldy to come over first. One day, Sandra and Billy made their way to Poldy's shed as usual, and the little bird was already out of his nest waiting for them. As soon as he saw Billy, he hopped over to the dog, then flew up and landed on Billy's nose. Sandra couldn't believe what she was seeing, and she suddenly regretted not having her camera with her. She made a quick decision to dash back to the house and grab her camera, not wanting to miss out on such a cute and unique interaction. She sprinted back to the shed with her camera slung around her neck, but now Billy and Poldy were nowhere to be seen. Her heart began to race. Billy had never hurt anyone or anything in his life. He really did live up to his gentle giant name, but he'd only just started interacting with Poldy, and the little outlet was still so small. Sandra started to fear the worst. How could she have been so stupid to leave the pair unattended, even if it was just for a few moments? All was quiet in the shed, and Sandra held her breath, trying to detect any noise that would point her in the direction of the giant dog and the little owl, but all she could hear was her heart racing. Just then, she thought she heard a faint grumble coming from within the shed. She didn't want to startle either animal, so she began to slowly move around the room, cautious not to make any loud noises or sudden movements. As she approached some boxes at the far end of the shed, the noise grew louder. She placed her camera down and leaned over the boxes, worried about what she would find. As the scene unfolded in front of her, she let out a loud gasp. Sandra had found Billy and Poldy, but it looked as though her worst fears were coming true. Billy had the tiny owlet in front of him between his giant paws. Sandra knew she had to act fast and tried to distract the dog so she could scoop up Poldy. She was painfully aware, though, that if she moved too fast, Billy would become frightened and react in a way that could end in disaster for Poldy. Before she even had time to think about what to do, though, Billy lowered his head towards the tiny owlet and did something that left her utterly speechless. Billy laid his head next to Poldy. The little owl fluffed himself up, then backed into the big dog and snuggled down right into him. Sandra's tears of worry had now turned into tears of joy. She got the situation all wrong, and she felt so guilty for misunderstanding Billy's actions. The big dog wasn't trying to hurt Poldy, he was looking after him. Billy hadn't been holding on to the owlet in a threatening way. He'd protectively wrapped his paws around the owl to keep him warm. Just like she had known that Poldy needed extra care, it seemed Billy also knew that as well. Grabbing her camera, Sandra wiped away her tears, knowing that she had to share this moment with the world. Meanwhile, Billy and Poldy closed their eyes and fell into a deep sleep together. Sandra couldn't believe what she was capturing. She knew that the moment between Poldy and Billy was special, but she never imagined the attention the photos would receive. Once the dog and the owl had napped together, Poldy made his way back to his nest. Billy seemed more content and relaxed than he'd ever been as he loyally followed Tanya back to the house. She spent the afternoon going through the photos she'd captured, picking out the best ones and editing them, then uploading them to her website and Instagram. Her social media accounts didn't have lots of followers, so she expected to get a few likes and maybe the odd comment, nothing more. After she uploaded the photos, Sandra forgot all about them. She was still marveling over what she'd witnessed with Billy and Poldy. Would this be a one-off thing, or had the moment marked the start of an unlikely friendship? Sandra went to bed that night still amazed at the sweet interaction between her two favorite animals. When she woke up the next day and looked at her phone, she was shocked by what she saw. The photos of Billy and Poldy had gone viral, and Sandra had thousands of notifications on her social media accounts. People from all over the world were liking and commenting on the photos, stating that it was just the sort of feel-good content they needed to see. People were desperate for more Poldy and Billy pics to be uploaded. Sandra opened her emails to find that her inbox had been flooded with requests from various media outlets, requesting to use the photos and articles about the unlikely duo. It was a lot for her to take in, but she couldn't deny that the sudden attention made her burst with pride. However, she didn't just want to force Billy and Poldy to pose for photos just to gain more followers on social media. She cared for the animals too much to do that, and she knew that she had to let any budding friendship unfold naturally. So over the next few weeks, Sandra made sure she always had her camera with her. She'd learned from her mistake that morning in the shed. She also made sure to monitor Poldy and Billy very carefully, but it turned out that she had nothing to worry about. The owl and the dog had become inseparable. Wherever Billy went, Poldy followed. Soon, the pair were playing in the woods or the river together. A whole new world had opened up to Poldy, and Billy was helping him explore it. Sandra was in awe of her gentle giant of a dog. She had always felt sad about the fact that Poldy would never live freely and had been concerned about how that would affect the young owl. But now, thanks to his protector, Poldy could explore the outside of his shed safely, and Sandra could not only worry less, but do what she loved the most: capture stunning photos of the pair. In the weeks after the original photo she had shared, she uploaded more photos of them, playing in the leaves and swimming in the river. Billy would always pick up a stick when he jumped in the river, and Poldy would hop on, letting the dog swim around with him balancing on the stick. Sandra's photos continued to gain attention from people all over the world, with many leaving comments about how they'd been moved to tears over how much Poldy and Billy loved each other. The unlikely pair settled into a friendship of protector and protected, and Sandra knew there'd be many more adventures to come. What do you think of Billy and Poldy's friendship? What would you think if you saw a big dog grab a tiny owl between its paws? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to like and subscribe for more.